52 years. That is how long the United States Army made Lieutenant Vernon Baker wait for the Medal of Honor he earned on April 5, 1945, the day he destroyed 6 German defensive positions alone, the day he killed more than 26 enemy soldiers alone, the day he saved his entire company alone, and the day America decided that a black hero was not a hero at all. This is the story of the greatest single day of combat heroism in World War II that almost no one knows about, and it is a story about courage, injustice, and a man who refused to let either define him. It was dawn on April 5, 1945, on a mountain in northern Italy near the town of Viareggio, and Lieutenant Vernon Baker was about to have the most extraordinary day of combat in World War II. His company had been ordered to attack German positions at Castle Aginolfi, a fortified hilltop with machine gun nests, concrete bunkers, and observation posts that gave the Germans clear fields of fire over the approaches. The attack had started badly as German machine guns opened fire the moment the Americans moved forward, cutting down men as they advanced, and Baker's company commander was hit in the first minutes of the battle. The company began to fall apart as men dove for cover and some started retreating, and Baker saw that if someone did not do something immediately, the entire attack would collapse and his men would die. So Vernon Baker made a decision that would save 200 lives and earn him a medal he would not receive for half a century. He would attack the German positions alone. Baker moved forward through machine gun fire, using every bit of terrain for cover, advancing toward the first German position, which was a machine gun nest that had already killed several Americans. He got close enough to throw a grenade and the explosion silenced the gun. Then Baker rushed the position with his rifle and killed the 2 German soldiers inside, neutralizing the first target. But there were 5 more positions ahead, and the Germans now knew someone was attacking their line. So they began concentrating fire on Baker's area as he moved toward the second position, which was an observation post on higher ground, where German spotters were directing mortar and artillery fire onto the American positions. Baker climbed the steep hillside under fire with bullets snapping past his head and shrapnel from explosions peppering the trees around him. And when he reached the observation post, he threw grenades and then charged with his rifle, killing the Germans there and eliminating the enemy's ability to coordinate their defensive fire. But to understand how Vernon Baker ended up alone on an Italian mountain fighting for his life and for his men, we need to go back to the beginning. Vernon Joseph Baker was born on December 17, 1919, in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and his parents died in a car accident when he was just 4 years old, leaving him and his sisters to be raised by their grandparents. His grandfather worked as a railroad porter and his grandmother took in laundry, and they were poor, but they gave Vernon something more valuable than money. They gave him dignity and taught him that a man's worth is determined by his actions, not by what others think of him. They also told him stories of black soldiers who had fought in every American war since the Revolution, men who served a country that did not always serve them back, and those stories planted a seed in young Vernon's mind that would grow into a sense of duty and service. When World War II began after the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Vernon Baker wanted to serve his country, and in June 1941 he enlisted in the United States Army at age 22. The Army was segregated with black soldiers assigned to separate units, often given inadequate equipment and training. But Baker was determined to prove himself. He went through basic training and showed such leadership potential that he was selected for Officer Candidate School, a rare opportunity for a black soldier, and in January 1943, Vernon Baker became a second lieutenant, one of the few black officers in the entire Army. He was assigned to the 92nd Infantry Division, an all-black division known as the Buffalo Soldiers, and in 1944 his unit shipped to Italy to join the fight against Nazi Germany, and by April 1945 Baker had been promoted to first lieutenant and commanded a weapons platoon. The moment the Americans moved forward, the Germans opened fire, and machine guns raked the hillside, cutting down men as they tried to advance. Baker's company commander, a white captain, was hit in the early minutes of the attack, and the company began to falter as men dove for cover, and some started pulling back. Baker saw what was happening. He saw his men dying. He saw the attack falling apart, and he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would attack alone. Baker moved forward through the machine gun fire, using the terrain for cover, moving from tree to tree, rock to rock, advancing toward the first German position, which was a machine gun nest that had already killed several Americans. He got close enough to throw a grenade, and the explosion silenced the gun. Then Baker rushed the position with his rifle and killed the 2 German soldiers inside, neutralizing the first position. But there were 5 more positions ahead, and Baker did not stop. He moved toward the second position, which was an observation post on higher ground, where German spotters were directing mortar and artillery fire onto the American positions. Baker climbed the steep hillside, under fire, reached the observation post, and killed the German soldiers there with grenades and rifle fire, eliminating the enemy's ability to coordinate their defensive fire. The third position was another machine gun nest that was enfilading the American line, meaning it was firing along the length of the American positions, causing devastating casualties, and Baker knew that if he did not take it out, the entire attack would fail. He moved through heavy fire, flanked the position, threw grenades into the nest, and then charged with his rifle, killing 3 more Germans and destroying the machine gun. By now, the Germans knew someone was attacking their positions, and they began concentrating fire on Baker's area, but he kept moving because he could see that his actions were giving his company a chance to advance. The fourth position was a fortified bunker with thick concrete walls and a heavy machine gun, nearly impossible to destroy with small arms. But Baker got close enough to throw a demolition charge through the firing slit, and the explosion destroyed the bunker and killed everyone inside. The fifth position was a sniper post that had been picking off American officers and sergeants, and Baker located it, moved into position, and killed the German sniper with precise rifle fire. The sixth and final position was a large dugout with multiple German soldiers who were preparing a counterattack, and Baker assaulted it alone, throwing grenades and firing his rifle, killing the Germans and destroying their position. In the span of less than 2 hours, Vernon Baker had single-handedly destroyed 6 German defensive positions, killed more than 26 enemy soldiers, and broken the back of the German defense on that section of the mountain. His actions had saved his company from being wiped out and had opened a path for the American advance. But when Baker returned to his lines, expecting to see his company moving forward, he found chaos instead. The white officers had ordered a retreat, and most of the company had pulled back, leaving Baker and a small group of soldiers isolated on the mountain surrounded by Germans. Baker had no choice but to lead his men in a fighting retreat back down the mountain, covering their withdrawal by engaging German forces. And by the time they reached American lines, Baker's platoon had suffered heavy casualties, but they had survived. Baker's company commander, who had been wounded early in the fight, recommended Baker for the Medal of Honor, citing his extraordinary heroism and leadership under fire. The recommendation was supported by other officers who had witnessed Baker's actions, and it was forwarded up the chain of command, where it should have been approved, and Baker should have received America's highest military honor. But it was 1945, and Vernon Baker was black, and despite clear evidence of his heroism, despite multiple witnesses, despite the fact that he had done everything required for the Medal of Honor and more, his recommendation was downgraded to a Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest award. Baker received his Distinguished Service Cross in a ceremony, and he wore it proudly, but he also knew something was wrong because he had seen white soldiers receive medals of honor for actions less significant than his, and the only difference was the color of their skin. Baker's company commander, who had been wounded early in the battle, wrote up a recommendation for Baker to receive the Medal of Honor, citing his extraordinary heroism and the fact that he had single-handedly destroyed 6 fortified positions, killed dozens of enemy soldiers, and saved the company from destruction. The recommendation was supported by multiple witnesses who had seen Baker's actions, and it was forwarded up the chain of command where it should have been approved because Baker had clearly met every criterion for the Medal of Honor and had done so in spectacular fashion. But Vernon Baker was black, and this was 1945, and despite the clear evidence of his heroism, despite the multiple witnesses, despite the fact that he had done everything required for the Medal of Honor and more, his recommendation was quietly downgraded to a Distinguished Service Cross without explanation. Baker received his Distinguished Service Cross in a ceremony later that year, and he wore it proudly because it represented recognition of his actions. But he also knew something was wrong because he had seen white soldiers receive medals of honor for actions less significant than destroying 6 enemy positions alone, and the only difference he could see was the color of their skin. Baker remained in the army after the war and served for 28 years, eventually retiring in 1968 as a captain. And he settled in Idaho, where he worked for the Veterans Administration and lived quietly, never seeking publicity and never publicly complaining about the Medal of Honor he had been denied. He raised a family, worked hard, became a respected member of his community, and carried the knowledge that he had been denied recognition because of racism, but he lived with dignity as his grandparents had taught him. The years passed, and Baker's story remained largely unknown outside of military circles. Just another black soldier whose heroism had been overlooked by a system that was not ready to acknowledge that a black man could be America's greatest hero. In the early 1990s, a study was commissioned to examine whether racial discrimination had led to black soldiers being denied medals of honor during World War II. And researchers compared Distinguished Service Cross citations awarded to black soldiers with Medal of Honor citations awarded to white soldiers. What they found was clear evidence of systematic discrimination, as not a single Medal of Honor had been awarded to a black soldier during World War II, despite hundreds of thousands serving, and the study identified 7 black soldiers whose actions clearly merited the Medal of Honor, including Vernon Baker. In 1996, Congress authorized upgrading these 7 Distinguished Service Cross medals to Medals of Honor, and of the 7 men, only Vernon Baker was still alive. The other 6 had died without receiving the recognition they deserved. On January 13, 1997, Vernon Baker stood in the White House as President Bill Clinton placed the Medal of Honor around his neck, 52 years after he had earned it on an Italian mountain. Baker was 77 years old and stood in his dress uniform as the president spoke about the courage Baker had shown, both in combat and in living with dignity despite injustice. And when Baker was asked to speak, he said he wished the other 6 men could have been there to receive their medals in person, and he dedicated his award to all the black soldiers who had served and died without recognition. He did not express bitterness about the 52-year wait. Instead, he expressed gratitude that the truth had finally been acknowledged, and he spent the remaining years of his life speaking to schools and military groups about service, sacrifice, and treating all people with dignity. Vernon Baker died on July 13, 2010, at the age of 90, and he was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors, his grave marked with the Medal of Honor he had finally received. His funeral was attended by military officials, veterans, and civil rights leaders, and President Obama issued a statement praising Baker's courage in combat and his dignity in the face of injustice. Baker's legacy lives on in the soldiers he inspired, in the military that became more integrated, partly because men like him proved that courage has no color, and in the ongoing effort to ensure that all heroes are recognized regardless of race. The story of Vernon Baker matters not just because of what he did on April 5, 1945, though destroying 6 enemy positions and killing dozens of German soldiers while saving his company certainly deserves remembrance. Baker's story matters because of what it reveals about America, that we can be capable of both extraordinary heroism and terrible injustice, sometimes toward the same person. Baker fought for a country that denied him basic rights. He risked his life for a nation that would not recognize his sacrifice, and he did so with courage and dignity that should humble us all. The fact that it took 52 years to give him the Medal of Honor is shameful, but the fact that it happened at all shows that America can acknowledge its mistakes and try to make them right, even if the process is painfully slow. On April 5, 1945, Lieutenant Vernon Baker climbed an Italian mountain and did something extraordinary, advancing alone against fortified enemy positions when his company was falling apart, destroying 6 defensive sites when retreat seemed like the only option, killing enemy soldiers when he could have hidden and survived, and saving his men when he could have saved only himself. He did this knowing that as a black officer in a segregated army, he might not receive the same recognition that a white officer would receive, but he did it anyway, because his sense of duty was not dependent on recognition. He did it because his men needed him to, because the mission required it, because it was the right thing to do regardless of what honors might follow. And that is the essence of heroism. Vernon Baker lived for 65 years after that day, serving his country, raising a family, working to help other veterans, and eventually receiving the Medal of Honor that had been denied him for half a century. He lived with dignity and grace, never becoming bitter despite having every reason for bitterness, never giving up on America despite America having given up on him in 1945. And that quiet dignity over 6.5 decades may be as impressive as anything he did in combat. His life teaches us that courage is not just facing enemy fire, but also facing injustice with integrity, that heroism is not just battlefield action, but how you live your entire life, and that serving something bigger than yourself gives meaning to existence, even when that service is not immediately recognized. First Lieutenant Vernon Joseph Baker, Medal of Honor, Distinguished Service Cross, Bronze Star, Purple Heart, December 17, 1919 to July 13, 2010, United States Army. He destroyed 6 enemy positions in 2 hours, was denied recognition for 52 years, and never lost his dignity. A true American hero, never forgotten. The Battle of Castle Aginolfi, where Baker earned his Medal of Honor, was part of the final Allied offensive in Italy, and the capture of the German positions that Baker helped secure contributed to the eventual Allied victory in that theater. The war in Europe ended 1 month later on May 8, 1945, when Germany surrendered, and while Baker's actions on April 5th were not the decisive battle of the war, they were decisive for the men of his company who lived because he fought. Every soldier who survived that day, every family that welcomed a father or son or brother home, owed that to Vernon Baker's courage, and the ripple effects of his actions extended far beyond the battlefield as those men went on to live full lives, have children and grandchildren, and contribute to their communities. The tactical actions that Baker took on April 5th are still studied in military schools as examples of individual initiative and aggressive leadership under fire. Military analysts note that Baker's success came from several factors, including his excellent training, his ability to use terrain for cover, his understanding of when to use grenades versus rifle fire, his willingness to take calculated risks, and his mental preparation to act alone when necessary. Baker himself later emphasized that soldiers must be trained to take initiative when plans fall apart, because in combat, you cannot always rely on others to be with you, and he stressed that the best training is training that prepares soldiers to think and act independently under pressure. The 7 black soldiers who finally received Medals of Honor in 1997 represented hundreds of other black soldiers who likely deserved the award, but whose cases were never reviewed or whose actions were not properly documented. The 92nd Infantry Division, the Buffalo Soldiers, fought with distinction throughout the Italian campaign, despite facing skepticism from some white commanders and despite being given inadequate support at times, and they proved that black soldiers could fight as effectively as anyone when given proper equipment, training, and leadership. The integration of the American military, which began in 1948, was partly driven by the undeniable evidence that black soldiers like Vernon Baker had provided through their battlefield performance. Baker's story also reminds us of the importance of documentation and witnesses in preserving history, because without the officers who wrote up his Medal of Honor recommendation in 1945 and without the soldiers who provided witness statements, Baker's story might have been lost entirely. The fact that his recommendation was downgraded in 1945 meant that for decades, the only official record was his Distinguished Service Cross citation, which mentioned his heroism but did not capture the full extent of what he had done. It was only when researchers in the 1990s went back and examined original witness statements and after-action reports that the truth emerged, and that truth was so clear that Congress had no choice but to upgrade his medal. The ceremony at the White House in 1997, where Baker received his Medal of Honor, was emotionally powerful because it represented not just recognition of one man's heroism, but acknowledgement of a systematic injustice that had affected countless black soldiers. President Clinton spoke about the importance of honoring all who serve regardless of race, and he acknowledged that the 52-year delay in recognizing Baker was shameful, but he also emphasized that America's strength lies in our willingness to confront our mistakes and try to correct them. Baker stood at attention as the medal was placed around his neck, and witnesses said that despite his age, he stood as straight and proud as he had on that Italian mountain decades earlier, and when he spoke, he focused not on himself, but on the other 6 men being honored that day, who had not lived to receive their medals. After receiving his Medal of Honor, Baker became something of a celebrity, though he was always uncomfortable with that label, and he was invited to speak at military academies, veterans events, and schools where he shared his story and the lessons he had learned. He emphasized several key themes in his talks, including that courage is action, despite fear, not absence of fear. That integrity means doing right, even when no one is watching. That serving something bigger than yourself gives life meaning. And that progress requires both demanding justice and being willing to forgive. He also spoke about practical military lessons from his experience, noting that training and preparation are what allow soldiers to perform under pressure. And he stressed that good leaders must earn their men's trust by showing that they value their soldiers' lives. Vernon Baker's grave at Arlington National Cemetery has become a site of pilgrimage for some military members and historians who come to pay respects to a man who embodied courage, integrity, and grace under impossible circumstances. Near his grave are the graves of other Medal of Honor recipients, and together they represent the highest ideals of military service, even though some, like Baker, had to wait decades for recognition. The Vernon J. Baker chapter of the 92nd Infantry Division Association was formed after his death to preserve his legacy and the legacy of all Buffalo soldiers, and several schools have been named after him so that future generations will learn his story. The integration of the American military that began in 1948 has led to today's much more diverse force, where soldiers of all races serve together, and where many black soldiers have achieved high rank, including several who have served as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. This progress did not happen automatically. It happened because people like Vernon Baker demonstrated through their actions that discrimination was wrong and that opportunity should be based on ability rather than race. Every black officer serving today stands on the shoulders of Vernon Baker and the other Buffalo soldiers who fought for a country that did not always fight for them. And their legacy is the more integrated and fair military that exists today. Baker's life after the war from 1945 to 2010 was in some ways as remarkable as what he did in combat, because he maintained his dignity and continued to serve despite being denied recognition, and he never became bitter, even though bitterness would have been entirely justified. He could have turned his back on the military and the country after being denied the Medal of Honor in 1945. He could have spent his life angry at the system that failed him, but instead, he chose to keep serving, to maintain his integrity, to believe that America could be better than its worst moments. That choice to respond to injustice with continued service rather than bitterness is perhaps as heroic as anything he did on the battlefield, and it set an example that continues to inspire. When we remember Vernon Baker, we should remember both April 5th, 1945, when he climbed a mountain and destroyed 6 enemy positions, and January 13th, 1997, when he finally received the recognition he had earned 52 years earlier, because both days tell us something important about courage and about America. The first day shows us what one person can do when they decide that their duty and their brothers matter more than their own safety. And the second day shows us that acknowledging past injustices and making them right, even decades late, is better than never acknowledging them at all. Baker's story is not just about one man's heroism, but about a nation's long, difficult journey toward living up to its ideals of equality and justice. Vernon Baker's example teaches us that true heroism is not just what you do in moments of crisis, but how you live your entire life. That courage can take many forms, including the courage to maintain your dignity when treated unjustly, and that serving something larger than yourself gives meaning to existence even when that service goes unrecognized. His story reminds us that heroes come from all backgrounds, and that we must be vigilant to ensure that all heroes are recognized regardless of race. And it challenges us to ask ourselves what injustices we are blind to today that future generations will look back on with shame. Vernon Baker waited 52 years for justice, and while that wait was too long, the fact that justice eventually came reminds us that progress is possible if we are willing to confront uncomfortable truths and make them right. On an Italian mountain on April 5, 1945, Lieutenant Vernon Baker proved that courage has no color, that heroism is defined by actions, not by race, and that one determined person can change the course of a battle and save dozens of lives. For the next 65 years, he proved that dignity and integrity can survive injustice, that serving your country does not require recognition, and that forgiveness does not mean forgetting. His name is now honored, his story is told, his Medal of Honor is displayed, and his legacy continues to inspire all who learn about the orphan from Wyoming who became a hero, was denied recognition, but never lost his dignity. First Lieutenant Vernon Joseph Baker, Medal of Honor, a true American hero whose story reminds us that justice delayed is still justice worth fighting for, never forgotten.